Hi guys, so my name's Genevieve and I am in group 4. I was assigned chapter 9, A Social Life by James M. Johnston. The beginning of this chapter, it talks about an assignment that Jordan, being the consultant, had been given. This assignment dealt with a boy named Bobby who was 13 years old with an intellectual disability. He was prone to the more aggressive behavior when resisting compliance with requests or when things didn't go his way. He has had a past with aggression and destruction. They talk about how parents try to reinforce the tantruming by complying with what the child wants to negate the tantrum, which is really doing the complete opposite because now the child knows that when he cries or whines or tantrums, they will get what they want for them to stop tantruming. So, for example, in my own personal life, we had worked with a child who couldn't zipper his jacket at home because his parents had always constantly done it. So what we worked on at school was having him zip his coat by himself. But when we would tell the parents that he does zip his coat at school, they tell us that they zipper it at home because it's what he expects out of them, and it reduces the chances of them either being late because he's going to tantrum or reduces the chances of him now ever doing it at home because they're always doing it. So, being familiar with these contingencies, behaviorists know that the appropriate way to lessen the outcome. Jordan got to know the family, and when he observed and saw that Bobby's other siblings reacted and showed the same tendency of aggression that Bobby showed, it wasn't so surprising to him as why he was showing it at his day program. In this beginning, it's showing that behaviors that Bobby sees and hears are being paired with what Bobby's showing at his day program. So Jordan suggests that it seemed to be the family culture throughout the whole family, and it's only what he sees. So Jordan didn't only see that he had to change and make the appropriate contingencies for Bobby, but that he had to somehow change the social interaction within the whole family as well in order for Bobby to lessen the aggression at the day program. In the end, in order to change such aggression behavior at the program, he can't be surrounded with it at home. And it is like, even if he has the possibility of it getting better at school, wouldn't be as high as if it were to change at home. So that was just like a quick example. So throughout the book, the first section of our chapter was called Culture. So this part of the chapter talks a lot about how we learn behavior through the social contingencies around us. Johnson uses some different examples. I look at it like, he uses different examples in the book, but for example, I look at it like if you were really hungry looking at food, you're more likely to salivate than when you were full looking at food. We learn a lot about social and cultural interaction by being around it. So, for example, if you grow up in a household that curses a lot and isn't aware of the children around that are surrounded by them, the child may go into school using that language because it was what their social contingencies are around them. Johnson talks about how us as humans respond to interactions depending on the situation. So in my own world, I was brought up to always say you're welcome and thank you, but in other households that's not how they were brought up, so they are less likely to use it in their own environment now. Many of us think that our behaviors are just mental, but these contingencies are free of the influence of culture, which is the same for all of us. So the next part of the book was natural selection. So Skinner talks about the 3 ways that natural selection underlies behavior. So the first one was the contingencies of survival revolve around the natural selection of different species. The second one was the special contingencies were evolved through social environment. And the third one was that repertoires that deal with contingencies of reinforcement are by all members. The next part was talked about a lot about operation behaviors. So operation behavior occurs in a faster time period than cultural practice, which goes in a lot slower pace, which, for an example, like it could be decades. The familiar elements of natural selection is variation, transmission, or replication, and selection. The behaviors as well vary in cultural selection. This chapter talked a lot about how behaviors that are modeled, such as following rules, are often followed by humans more often than not. The next part of the chapter was called Where Can This Lead? So they explain the cultural based behaviors long term and captured by the type of framework you are surrounded by. Johnson talks about cultural shifts. I use the example of a cultural shift as something that has changed over time. So I use the example of tattoos. Back in the day, I feel that you were a less desirable and hireable human being if you had been covered with tattoos, as in this time there's not much more thought into it. It's just basically looking at what the person portrays rather than what they look like. Cultural practices are often described as rights and values, which faces conflict between existing and proposed practices. An example Johnson uses is obesity, so just constantly being around advertisements and being at a lower price for the junkier food. He uses just that disorder as an example. He talks about counter control, which is a behavior that mitigates or eliminates adversive sources of control, more likely in the context of social contingencies. This has me think of something that we aren't on the same page about, and we challenge these facts, such as placement for your children for the following year. So I know that I work with teachers who feel that their kids belong in more of a self-contained setting, but the parents think that maybe their child will benefit from being in co-teaching. So you think of different ways that the parent thinks and different ways that the teacher thinks, which could possibly overrule. The next part is cultural engineering. So cultural engineering doesn't just talk about our culture, it overlaps with verbal communications and verbal communities. There's different cultures throughout our work. There's also different cultures throughout our siblings and our family and our interests. So it's not just, when people think culture, it's not just whether they're white, they're black, they're Hispanic. It's more of everything else around you that you're not thinking about. Cultures can change so easily from working with one person for 1 hour to working with someone else another hour. So that's just a little bit of an example of how you would go about working with someone. I know in my personal life I could be working with one child for a half hour and then another child for a half hour, and both ways I would be working with them would be completely different. Culture gives us power to experience challenges within these aspects. Throughout the whole chapter, it talks about how cultures are not decided in terms of where you live. There's much more little aspects of culture that you don't always think about. Each person is in its own member of their group, which takes place while taking place in other verbal communities. So my two questions were, do you feel that culture plays an impact in your life? And have you ever experienced cultural engineering in your life as well?